This video was brought to you by Skillshare.
Hello, I'm a new character. My name is, I don't know, Noah. Noah, the vaguely hipstery artist guy. I'm a creative. I've got so many projects I want to work on, so many mediums I want to dip into. And that, my creative friends, is why I just joined Skillshare.
Skillshare is an online learning community where you can develop your skills in illustration, animation, music, photography, creative writing, and more. Learn about your craft with a series of video lessons, then engage with a hands-on project. Most classes can be completed in under an hour, and there are thousands to choose from, so you can tailor the experience completely to your needs and your schedule. Personally, I'm thinking I'll start with comedy filmmaking. Make your online videos 100% funnier. Something I could really use.
Take it from me, Noah, that friend of yours that's always working on some creative project. Skillshare is an incredible resource for honing your creative skills. With a yearly plan, it's less than $10 a month for unlimited access to the entire community and every lesson. Also, the first 1,000 of my subscribers, Arlo's subscribers, whatever! The first 1,000 to click the link down in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. So open up your wings and let your creativity soar. Okay, maybe I should put some singing lessons on my list. Gigantic! Hello, my wondrous friends. So, I like Zelda a whole lot. We've been over this before. However, when someone says the name Zelda, my mind usually shoots to the big 3D home console entries. But that's not exactly fair, because in a sense, the Zelda IP consists of two separate concurrent series, the 3D games and the top-down, or what I refer to as 2D games. And for whatever reason, whenever I'm trying to list all my top Nintendo series, I forget to include 2D Zelda separately. I definitely should include it though, because I absolutely adore 2D Zelda. I mean, some of my favorite games of all time are 2D Zeldas. I've got a problem though. As with any series, 2D Zelda has moved in various different directions over the years, and of course, not every one of those new directions has resonated perfectly with every fan. And unfortunately, I've been in the not resonating camp for quite some time. In fact, I haven't been completely satisfied with a 2D Zelda in well over a decade. Going on 2. I'm not saying I've hated all the titles that have come out in that time, and stay tuned to hear about my specific issues, obviously, but it seems that for whatever reason, Nintendo just hasn't been interested in creating the kind of game I've been looking for. I'm certainly not going to suggest that the series has been failing or slipping or whatever. In fact, most people just love all these games to pieces. This is very much a video about my own personal opinions on the series. From my perspective, I keep looking at it and going, what happened? What's going on? And that is why I am here now. Let's take a look at the 2D Zelda series, where it came from, where it's been, where it is today, and where I hope it goes.
Naturally, 2D was the very first form Zelda took. Before Ocarina of Time split the series just as it split the timeline, this is just what Zelda was. The NES gave us 2 Zeldas, then the SNES gave us the first big flashy next-gen Zelda sequel, and the Game Boy gave us a perfect follow-up to that despite being the Game Boy. But personally, apart from watching my friend play Link's Awakening on his Super Game Boy, I didn't play a Zelda game until Ocarina of Time. 3D was my starting point. It was the single most impressive thing that I had ever seen in terms of graphics, immersion, and scope. It was a groundbreaking AAA blockbuster if ever there was one. I would never blame a person for picking up Ocarina of Time and never looking back. 2D Zelda? Why? We've got this now, and it's way better! And yet, when I later picked up Link's Awakening DX on my Game Boy Color, I was immediately hooked. What were there, like 10 pixels on that screen? Didn't matter. The gameplay was still incredibly engaging, and the world was a joy to explore. Then, a couple years after that, oh boy was I in for a treat. Nintendo blessed us with not one new Game Boy Zelda, but 2! Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons were not like Pokemon games, largely identical with only minor differences. No, these were 2 separate, complete experiences. Can you believe that? There was once a time when Nintendo was willing to give us 2 Zelda games at once, and they only went with 2 because they couldn't quite manage 3. The Oracle games were big, they were in full color with lots of in-game art, the mechanics were fresh and fun, they took place in new kingdoms we'd never seen before, you could trade special codes between them to unlock items and unique character interactions, and if you played them both, you got to unlock a ton of extra story stuff and an entire separate series of final bosses and an ultimate ending. The games were incredible, if you ask me. And I think it's safe to say that even if I loved Link's Awakening, the Oracle games cemented 2D Zelda in my heart forever. And you can bet that after that adventure, I was eager for more. I never did go back and play the NES Zeldas. Multiple attempts to do so have failed over the years because too hard. But when Nintendo re-released Link to the Past on GBA, well, hot dog, I was there. Same as before, I had only watched my friend play the game a little bit, so I was eager to give it a try for myself. Funny enough, despite being developed for substantially stronger hardware, I found it a good deal less enjoyable at first. It was the combat, really. That sword is just so tiny. But I still ended up loving the game to pieces, and it's got some of my favorite music in the whole series. Lost Woods is my #1 Zelda track of all time, in case you were wondering. Fast forward a few years, I'm gearing up to enter adulthood. The world is big and exciting, but also kinda scary, and Nintendo blesses me with an original Zelda title for the GBA. I specifically remember picking up Minish Cap at Best Buy and having this odd comforting feeling. Like, the world may be scary, but at least Nintendo is still making these Zelda games. And I tell you, the game blew me away all over again. It was the awesome gameplay and level design from the previous games, but now with positively gorgeous pixel art and a load of incredibly clever new concepts. By the time I played Minish Cap, I had pretty recently played Wind Waker, so it's not like I was still comparing this 2D stuff with those aging N64 graphics. No, I could see the exciting directions 3D Zelda was heading, and yet 2D Zelda never stopped being wholly enjoyable in its own way. But why exactly is that, do you think? Well, the way I see it, 2D and 3D Zelda both share the exact same basic building blocks. You play as Link, you gotta beat the bad guys, you collect these items to move through the world and beat said bad guys. You conquer dungeons filled with puzzles and more still of those bad guys, and at some point you probably come across a princess or a master sword or a Triforce or some such thing. At least pre-Breath of the Wild, both styles really are the same thing at heart. Anyone who plays one will be immediately familiar with the other. The 2D games are obviously quite limited in what they can do. The graphics are much more basic, the camera is fixed primarily at the one top-down angle, and in most cases the control options are very limited. You'd think this would mean 2D Zeldas were simply inferior to 3D ones, and that it was simply worth the sacrifice to have a Zelda on a handheld. But that's not true. 2D Zelda's limitations also happen to be the source of their strength. With a fixed camera, it's way easier to see a whole room at once, and with a grid-based structure and simpler movement, it's easier for the designers to include more involved puzzles. That's really what it comes down to the most, I think, the puzzles. 3D Zeldas have plenty of tricky dungeons and puzzles, but 2D Zeldas focus on that element a lot more sharply. It does, of course, go deeper than that, though. When discussing games, I frequently refer to what I call function versus feel. You can probably understand what I'm talking about when I say that 3D Zeldas are all about feel. You feel like you're on an epic adventure. It's all in complete 3D, so it feels more complicated and modern and cool. Sometimes you gotta ride a horse around an empty field, and not much happens when you do, but that's okay because it just feels good to be a cool guy riding around on a horse on your way to do something cool. 2D Zeldas, on the other hand, are all about that function. The dungeons and puzzles are more tightly designed, the world is more dense, every screen has stuff going on, everything is quicker, the combat is much simpler. They're just more condensed, pure video gaming experiences. And that's why they're not only able to survive standing toe-to-toe with their 3D siblings, they actually thrive. They survive on their own merits. They offer a complementary and legitimately unique experience. I myself am a big feel guy. I love 3D Mario, but I'm not a big fan of 2D Mario at all, for instance. I need more freedom of movement, more sense of exploration, more excitement. And yet, here I am, appreciating 2D Zelda for how pure and mechanical it is. I think it's because even a more basic Zelda experience is still very stimulating to me. And maybe it's also because I have both kinds of Zelda to enjoy. I can appreciate each kind's unique strengths and always be perfectly satisfied no matter what system I'm playing them on. Or at least that's how it used to be. But unfortunately, the last several years have altered what I once thought was an unalterable relationship between 2D and 3D. I haven't felt that warm, contented feeling of 2D-3D harmony since way back in 2004. And I suppose I better stop beating around the bush and tell you what I mean. When Nintendo revealed the DS, I was there for it. Rarely have I ever been more impressed with a piece of tech. I was obsessed with the thing and all its fancy capabilities. And as with any Nintendo system, I was excited to see new versions of all my favorite series. I loved the whole two-screen concept and wanted to know how Nintendo might use it to enhance gameplay formulas that I already loved. And when the time finally came and Nintendo revealed their latest 2D Zelda adventure, I was crestfallen. You see, back then, all this blue ocean stuff was very new. Touchscreen and motion controls and all that only seemed like an awesome idea to me. I hadn't even considered the idea of Nintendo taking it all too far and, in my own eyes, damaging their games as a result. But here it was, a Zelda game controlled almost entirely through touch. And I absolutely did not understand how that could possibly be a selling point. That was just a terrible idea, pure and simple. I had to pinch myself. I thought I was having a bad dream. And on top of that, the game looked horrid. Going from the lush, gorgeous pixel art of Minish Cap to the blocky sub-PS1 mega low-res graphics of Phantom Hourglass gave me some hardcore visual whiplash. Now, I must pause and remind you again that this is all just my opinion. Most people absolutely adored the DS Zeldas, and they sold just fine, so I'm not gonna tell you that Nintendo did a bad and messed everything up. This is my own experience with the series. Okay? Just gotta make sure you know that, or the comments will be nothing but people mad at me for hating on a game that they like. So anyway, I didn't play Phantom Hourglass when it came out, which says a lot, I think, considering how obsessed I had been with the series up to that point. I did end up playing it several years later, though, and I felt like my initial reaction was pretty much justified. Yeah, it's an ugly game. I think over time, those kinds of graphics have grown on me a little bit, like in a crummy, blocky, nostalgic kind of way. But next to Minish Cap, it don't look too good at all. And those controls. I can definitely see how they open up some new possibilities. You wouldn't be able to draw boomerang paths quite so quickly and effortlessly with traditional controls, so that's a plus. But if you ask me, that isn't even almost worth the trade-off. It's just not fun to do everything with the touchscreen. It's cumbersome, it's less accurate. I'll try to do one gesture and it'll think I'm doing another. You can basically only be doing one thing at a time. It's just unpleasant. It absolutely brings the entire experience down. I did still have some fun with the game. It was still made by a good team, but them controls, nothing could ever make that element better. Also, that dungeon you have to do like a million times, that didn't help much either. But that's okay, because Phantom Hourglass was just one game, right? Just one little experiment? There was still plenty of time for Nintendo to make a more traditional 2D Zelda. Years of life and many Nintendo systems ahead of me. All I had to do was wait. So wait, I did. And I wish I can say that waiting worked out for me. A few years after Phantom Hourglass, Nintendo revealed Spirit Tracks. And this was upsetting to me on many levels. I had spent years shouting about how Nintendo should work on timely asset reusing sequels again, as they did with Majora's Mask. Here, they finally did it, and it was to produce a timely sequel to the only Zelda game I ever disliked. They were popping out another touch-controlled title. It was also something of a follow-up to Phantom Hourglass's story, which itself was a direct sequel to Wind Waker. So now Nintendo was creating a whole new branch of the timeline, continuing a story I was previously very invested in, and they were doing it through games I just did not want to play. Also, Spirit Tracks had this whole train thing, which was a really cool concept. I like trains. I want to play Train Zelda. But, again, those controls. I distinctly remember how I felt when I watched the Spirit Tracks reveal trailer. I didn't feel any massive disappointment or anger or sadness or anything about the game itself. I really just felt nothing. I was watching a trailer for a brand new Zelda game, and I just did not care in the slightest. I might as well have been watching the latest Mario Party trailer or something. And that is what made me feel awful. The simple fact that I had literally zero interest in a series I previously loved to death. I watched the reveal of the latest game and felt nothing. It's another example of a concept that would become all too common later on. I did end up playing Spirit Tracks as well, only a few years ago actually. Shout out to my buddy Nolan for lending it to me. And once again, I was pretty conflicted. There's some cool stuff in the game, for sure. The train isn't as free as the boat was, but it's kind of fun to drive around and blow the little whistle. That overworld theme is an absolute banger. But the controls don't feel much better the second time around. The dungeons don't feel like they become interesting until near the end of the game, and there are lots of other little problems here and there. I just didn't enjoy the experience a whole lot. And that was that. A whole console generation of 2D Zeldas pretty much shot. At that point, I didn't know what Nintendo's plan was for the series, but I just had to hope that moving into the 3DS era, they had already gotten their fill of the gimmicky stuff. It had been many long years since Minish Cap, and I was ready. I wanted my 2D Zelda fix. And in 2013, Nintendo finally gave me a game that came pretty close. I really enjoyed Link Between Worlds. Gone were the touch controls. The graphics were much nicer this time around. The item rental system did remove some of the satisfaction of progression you usually get in these games, but the ability to complete most of the dungeons in any order was incredibly fun and refreshing. Then of course the painting mechanic, that added a terrific spin to the gameplay and was utilized in some extremely clever ways. I 100%ed the game, then immediately dove back in for another run. It was a heck of a good time. So then, what's the problem, Arlo? Wasn't Link Between Worlds the return to form you'd been waiting for? Well, I mean, it almost was. It was in some ways, but unfortunately there are still some elements of the game that fall flat for me. One big issue is the puzzle difficulty. The Game Boy Zeldas in particular had these sprawling dungeons with some really tricky sequences, spanning many different rooms and floors and areas. By comparison, Link Between Worlds dungeons feel very basic. Cleverly designed, don't get me wrong, but completable without much thinking or effort. I can blast through a dungeon in what feels like 10 minutes. This might have something to do with the fact that you can do them in any order, like they kind of had to even out the complexity to make it all flow properly. But whatever the case, it's a game I can just fly through. That process is undoubtedly enjoyable, but it's not as engaging as I would like. It doesn't stick in my mind as strongly. I can't even remember most of the game's dungeons, whereas I can still vividly remember some of the ones from the Oracle games, which I played over a decade earlier. That's really not my biggest problem, though. My biggest problem is the reused world. Link Between Worlds is essentially a sequel to Link to the Past, and it uses the same basic map. There are, of course, many differences, and overall, it's just a different game. But it still just bugs me to no end. Already knowing the map layout before heading into the game for the first time significantly hampered the sense of mystery and exploration I crave in Zelda games. Taking place in Hyrule isn't necessarily a bad thing, obviously. I prefer new kingdoms, but if an iteration is fresh and new enough, I'm fine with a new version of the same old place. Minish Cap did it that way, but using the same exact map? It didn't feel like it did anything for the game. It just felt like an excuse to capitalize on nostalgia and not have to do as much design work. I don't know if that's true, but it's how it felt to me as I played it. I want a new adventure, not a recycled old one. I want Zelda games to take place in new places and tackle new themes, but in too many ways, this felt like a rehash. I mean, don't even get me started on the story. Light World and Dark World, I get that. But Low Rule? What even is Low Rule? Why is there another alternate Hyrule? So there are 3 now? And of course, mechanically, this just means another game where you switch between the worlds. One is normal, one is kinda darker and more dangerous. Basically, Link to the Past again! Except now with alternate versions of characters that exist for reasons that are not explained, and another lame attempt to resurrect Ganon because we haven't had enough of that exact story yet. Many will argue that these are nitpicks and that perhaps I should just shush my muffins and enjoy the gameplay. But the lack of originality really soured the experience for me, I'm sorry. After playing it for the first time, I decided that Link Between Worlds was fun, and I was glad Nintendo had returned to a normal control scheme, but it still wasn't the full, completely original Zelda experience I'd been waiting for. There was a silver lining though, and after all those years, I once again found myself going, you know what? That's okay. Maybe next time. I shook off the apathy brought on by Spirit Tracks and began to care again. See, because after Spirit Tracks, I knew that the idea of quick sequels was on the table again. Now that Nintendo had gone through the effort of crafting a new Zelda for the 3DS, all they had to do was take all that and build it into a new story, maybe even in a new place. This was a strategic move. Save yourself some development time by heavily leaning on the building blocks of Link to the Past, then make the follow-up project even easier. Very clever! All I had to do was wait for the next 3DS Zelda. And did we get one? We sure did. Was it what I was hoping for? Not even close! Enter Triforce Heroes, a primarily multiplayer game in the style of Four Swords, which I haven't mentioned yet because it hardly feels like it counts as a traditional 2D Zelda experience. I played Four Swords Adventures a little on the GameCube, but it's really not that fun for only one person, and it's less of a legitimate adventure and more of a series of challenges. And Triforce Heroes looked to be the exact same thing. It still does, in fact, and reading about it hasn't changed my mind. Don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for these kinds of games. And I'm sure if I were able to convince two friends to collectively spend another $80 so I could play Triforce Heroes with them, we would have had a decent time. But a traditional 2D Zelda adventure, it ain't. And Triforce Heroes, for whatever reason, was the only other Zelda game they decided to make using the Link Between Worlds style. Another game with a trailer I watched with a largely blank but ever so slightly defeated look on my face. It's okay, I thought, and may or may not have actually believed. I'll just wait a few more years. And wait, I did. And my reward, 4 whole years later, was the Link's Awakening remake on Switch. If you saw my review, you know I thought the game was fun. I mean, at least as fun as the original, with some nice quality of life improvements. But it missed an opportunity to expand upon the original and make it even better, instead falling back on an exact one-to-one remake using a weird toy-like style. I had other little problems with it as well, but overall the main issue in the context of this discussion was, naturally, that this was a remake. It wasn't even a new game, so it certainly didn't scratch my 2D Zelda itch. And yet, it sure did use up the slot of a 2D Zelda game, didn't it? We had to wait years for it, and yet it was just another chance for Nintendo to dance around the idea of actually making a new, traditionally controlled 2D Zelda not based on any specific previous game. And that right there is the point I'm trying to make here. It feels like Nintendo is very deliberately trying not to make a plain old 2D Zelda that Arlo really wants to play. And naturally, I have to wonder why that might be. One possibility is that they've begun looking at 2D Zeldas differently and feel that they can't stand on their own anymore. Maybe they think they have to rely on either a heavy gimmick or nostalgia in order to make 2D Zelda marketable enough. I mean, it's certainly possible, especially when you see where 3D Zelda has gone and how epic it's become. Or maybe the team is having a hard time coming up with good stories for 2D Zeldas and are saving their best material for the 3D games. Also possible. When you reuse elements as much as Zelda does, maybe you just have to be a little more strategic with your releases. Or maybe it's just too hard to split the primary directorial staff between two projects. No one's got time for a proper 2D Zelda because everyone's working on consoles? Or are they just not creatively interested in 2D Zelda anymore now that 3D Zelda has gotten so advanced and exciting? Or is it possible that this has all just been a coincidence? That every 2D Zelda is whatever they want it to be at the time, and they're just following their hearts and making whatever they feel like, and this happens to be it? I've told myself it was just a coincidence. I've told myself all I had to do was wait a little longer. The next 2D Zelda will be the real one for sure. And yet, game after game after game, it just isn't coming. Nintendo just doesn't want to do it. Year after year, I lose more and more hope that it will ever happen. And that's ridiculous, because anything can happen. It probably is just a coincidence. But when you spend 17 years wondering why things just won't go in your direction, you have to wonder if they ever will again. I mean, it's only natural. I will admit, we're now in a somewhat similar situation to the one after Link Between Worlds. Nintendo has built a new 2D Zelda framework. It is very much possible that at this very moment, they're working on the game I want to play. I had my doubts about 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda coexisting on one hybrid system. I mean, do you price them differently? How do you expect people to pay the same price for a 2D Zelda and something like Breath of the Wild? Well, I got my answer there. Link's Awakening sold very well, despite being an exact remake of a super old Game Boy game priced at $60. There's a fine chance that Nintendo saw those numbers and decided that an original 2D Zelda on Switch would be a worthy investment. Unless, of course, those sales were boosted by the fact that it was a remake of a beloved game and an original title wouldn't do as well. It's possible. Usually remakes and ports are at a disadvantage because lots of people don't want to double dip. But is it different in this case because the original is so old and so highly regarded? I don't know. But I do know they could announce the game I'm looking for at any time. I expect Breath of the Wild 2 to come first, but after that, who knows? Between 2D, 3D, ports, spin-offs, remasters, and remakes, we really do get a Zelda game every year. At least we have been for quite a while now. Any year could be the year. The year Nintendo just makes a 2D Zelda game. A normal one. An original one. One that doesn't disappoint me with its art style, maybe, if I'm lucky. Or we'll get another remake, or a retread, or one based entirely on some weird Switch 2 gimmick. And the cycle will continue. But who knows? We've just got to wait and see. In the meantime, please tell me I'm not completely alone here. Tell me there's at least someone out there who also feels like 2D Zelda hasn't been what it's got the potential to be for nearly 2 decades now. And while you're at it, tell me what you'd like to see in a new 2D Zelda. Do you have different reasons for your 2D Zelda discontentment? Do you actually prefer all the modern titles? Would you like to see the series move in another weird direction? Will the Switch 2 revive the Nintendo Vitality Sensor and give us our first Zelda game played entirely using our pulse? Whatever the case, type some words at me down in the comments. And if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play Minish Cap. Again. I'm not really gonna play Minish Cap. I've got too much work and like other games and stuff. I just needed a closer. I know it wasn't a great one. Sometimes you just gotta go with what works.